Okay. Thank you very much for your presentations. I started my introduction with a question: what is actually the opposite of universal architecture? Is it the local architecture or the particular architecture? I think we definitely need to add, if we keep Kenneth Frampton's critical regionalism in mind, the regional architecture as a potential opposite to universal architecture in mind. But I'm sure there are also many, many combinations. Christian, you ended with this beautiful insight into your work, and you also introduced us to two of your slogans, and the two slogans were hire locally, source regionally. Could you let us know what this actually means on a practical level, and is there also a universal element embedded in these practices, please?
Yes. Whenever we say that, we never mean... so if I go back to low fab, we realize that with the technology, we need to make our slogan hashtag length. So we did low fab. But it always comes out as though it's like low cost and low quality. And we insist on that not being the case. So sourcing regionally and hiring locally, in many cases, usually ends up being expensive. But it's the only way we're able to bring what we call the human handprint back into projects that we architects are carrying on at the moment, because we feel like that's one thing that has been lost for some time in the development of architecture for the past I don't know, 100 years or 50 years. But basically what happens is we're looking at people as the end users of the product, the solution, or whatever we create, but we never look at them as participants and part of implementing that solution. And we believe that's very important, whether you're talking about sustainability, where we say, on my project I use, let's say, local materials, but we insist that it's not local materials if it's not married with local skills and local processes and all of those things. So we insist that human presence be part of that. But does not mean that the solution has to be something that already exists there. It could be something that is imported, that is improved, that is tweaked, that is borrowed by it's adapted. The solution itself could be universal, but it's how it's thought about being implemented. Because in this era of advances in technology, you can send something to, I don't know, Madrid, and someone 3D print it for you and send it back to you in a mailbox. You can't really say that we can create, like we can only rely on creating like our own localized solutions. But when it comes to the point where we have to implement something on the ground with the community, we argue that it is important for us to work with the same community that we're working with to be able to implement that solution.
I imagine when we discuss today the topic of the universal and the universalism in architecture, there are many differences in contrast to the situation 100 years ago, in contrast to the Bauhaus situation. And amongst the many differences, one could at least list our post-colonial condition. That's probably one of the biggest contrasts. Then also our experiences with participation processes, and the third key difference could be our digitalized situation, which allows mass fabrication, mass customization. I'm sorry, Marion von Osten, you introduced us in your presentation to a project in Casablanca, which I read as a project on the threshold between a colonial and a post-colonial condition. Could you expand on that, and by letting us know which role the universal and the local and the regional played in this project?
Yeah, maybe you have sometimes you have this kind of findings and then they haunt you, and this kind of projects it follows me, one could say. So there are so many kind of knowledges since I've started to be interested in this, and maybe I have to say that it started in Zurich and not in Casablanca, because a building was turned down that was built in 1956 in the outskirts of Zurich, and it was actually deeply racist. The whole discourse, it was a banlieue discourse, and people were, not with non-Swiss passports. And we, as cultural producers, were introduced to have interim studios. I mean, my students. So yeah, I was deeply involved in these ambivalences, and I think where I'm talking from is the ambivalences that we are all part of. We are not. We cannot wash ourselves free from all that kind of history. We are mainly in the middle of that whole discussions. And the interesting thing why this building was erased is just the opposite of what we have seen from both of them. So you have parallel to these new projects in the very moment, you have also dynamics where you would turn down a building because it's adapted, because people are living there with no passports, because they are living there that came with a migrant background or working in the service industries, because they inhabit it, because they are dwelling, because they are kind of co-producing with the building. And I think in this kind of ambivalence we have to think also about this kind of colonial modern which I introduced, which definitely goes back as well to some of the debates Ina has introduced before. I think that there's something which interested me in this project to look back is the question of the expert. Who is the expert? Because what I can think of in this moment of the colonial and the post-colonial, or the times of decolonization, is that suddenly was in question something which was a very young figure, the architect. Because the architect is not the builder, Baumeister, it's actually a new figure, it actually combines a lot of features. And I have the feeling that we're now coming back to the builder. It's maybe more about assisting processes that, on the one hand are produced by other people, the dwellers, regional materials, the people who have knowledge. And I think that's quite an interesting turn in architecture discourse where we are right now. And I have the feeling that it started in this very moment, or not feeling, some evidence in this very moment in the post-war situation. But it still has this kind of, there is this shadow, the spectre of colonialism in all our everyday lives situation. But as you see, there are also other answers now coming back, and I think that's quite promising and interesting.
Marion von Osten, one of your slides said, "Who builds?" ? And I think this leads us also to your project, Anne-Julchen Bernhard, the Structure plus Settler project from Hamburg that you also transformed for the Venice Architecture Biennale. Would you agree that as soon as there's an element of participation is coming in, a regional architecture, variations of a regional understanding of architecture comes into a universal design project? I read your Structure plus Settler project as a project that is universal and local at the same time, but not regional. From what your
it's not regional because I think the question of regionality is quite difficult in the year 2016. It's somehow stupid.
Thank you.
But of course, I would prefer to name it as the specific, which is a little bit also stupid because it's the title of the whole symposium, that the specific would come in with the settler, because I think it's really interesting to somehow find out which kind of elements are the one which lasts somehow, or which transfer into a new context. But it's of course it's not so easy to describe them just as regional, because in our yeah, it's transnational. It's trans everything, because it's because you can't. I think there's only a few parts of the world where not the whole globalization context is there. So it's really impossible to describe something as not just typically Syrian origin somehow. So it is something which is specific, but on the other hand, it's built with German materials and with perhaps an English manual described and so on. So it's not so easy to just say it's from here.
Mm-hmm. Before we open the discussion for the floor, another question to you, Christian. You mentioned the role of standardization. I read the idea of standards as an effort to introduce a kind of small element of the universal on a national level. Could you let us know what your experiences are? I'm also asking this because the Ash Plus, the magazine behind this symposium, is recently published an issue on the question legislating architecture. So what are your experiences as an architect and researcher with introducing standards for governments, etc.?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think we had very high-heated debates when we were doing those projects, because essentially what we expected to deliver to the government, I think at least what the government engineers were expecting was a floor plan of a hospital that they can build everywhere in the country, and we said no, we can't do that. We can only research and understand what makes a hospital function, be efficient, be have like some measure of airborne infection control and measures in place, and we can map that out as a diagram. But when it's time to turn that into a project to actually put in the ground, you actually need professionals who can design and engineer it and build it in a way that is going to function. Of course, we build in some guidance on, there's a slide I showed with how do you orient your buildings, the cross ventilation, how do you cap it so it doesn't grow beyond its capacity or things like that. But we always have problems when it comes to housing typologies, for instance. You say the regionalism concept in projects is very difficult, and it's true, because when you think about housing projects, they're much more complex, and they're probably much more than they have a social component that is much bigger than the architectural component that they have, and that what makes them different from, let's say, for instance, like schools and hospitals, where you can say, if we agree that basic healthcare is a human right, and then we should say everybody should have access to quality healthcare. And now that quality is the one that is left to debate on, say, what's the minimum standards that is acceptable for a human being to receive this quality healthcare in a dignified environment. What should a 6-year-old child have as a learning space? What should a 12-year-old student have for education space? And these are questions that even developed societies such as the US are not answering, but again and again, science is proving that all our basic our assumptions are either outdated, they're no longer relevant in this time, in this era where we are, where like there's fast information and technology that is available, that has changed the way we think, that has changed the way we eat, the way we converse with each other, the way we learn, or the way we seek healthcare and education and learn. And all of these things are things that the professionals in architecture, we need to constantly questioning is, do our buildings really do what they're supposed to do, or they don't? If they don't, if they failed, the professor who was here earlier, I'm very bad with names, I've noted he said, like, you know, if they're not working in the modern era, we should put them in the museum and we move on to something new that works. And I feel like, you know, it's true. Like, there's a lot of questioning we need to do to see if what we're doing is actually what we're supposed to be doing.
Thank you. So I suggest we open the discussion for you. Are there any comments or questions? Yeah, please. I think we have a microphone somewhere. Yeah, it's coming.
Yeah, thank you for the presentations. I'm very happy about the architectural presentations especially, and they're certainly not meant to be called just Werkvorträge. They're certainly much deeper going. What surprised me most was the moment when the settlers brought up the demand on a facade on the exterior designed by you as the architect. And I was asking myself, where does this come from? I suppose there is a certain desire for identity or specificity of the architectural expression of your building where you're living in. So, and with this thought, I would like to bring up the question if at the end maybe the architect as an kind of individual author could as well be an opposite to the universal, the singular architect as another alternative, as another opposite for the universal. What would you feel about that role?
Yeah, of course, we were also really surprised by the question of the settlers as a group and a non-described group, because they were just buying a flat. But they asked us to design the outside of the building because they felt that that they live in a multi-family, on a multi-story, a bigger building. Then of course it proposes the question of something like a common ground. So it's that the outside of the building is supposed to be general for this entity, and I think we thought that in the whole discussion about individualization, it really surprised us, but somehow I think that the current state is different than we expect it to be, because it seems to be more universal than, or more on a common level of understanding of what a building should look like in a city than we thought.
Do we have more questions or comments? Yes, here. Microphone is coming.
Thank you also for the presentation. I have a maybe quite obvious question, because we're talking about, can the universal be specific, and you were giving quite specific examples of your work. And now I would wonder, how big are your hopes, because we're having simultaneous translation, we're having video, and we're spreading a bit to the universal. How big are your hopes that you're understood, and how big is the risk that your specific knowledge is universalized or misinterpreted?
Is this a question to anyone specific here?
No, all of them.
Okay, so I think we can forward this question to Ashplas, probably.
I think culture processes are always about misunderstanding, misrecognition, translations. I think that's part of it. And definitely there is a limit of direct understanding, and even though that we maybe know somebody and we would speak with somebody, maybe the person would not understand us. So I think it's a very, very important question, but I think on the other hand, it's actually how things go. It's about there is no direct transfer of one information to the other. Maybe that's something which we can discuss later for the digital.
Maybe one more question. Yes, Philipp Oswald, please.
Question to Christian. I'm curious, with your education you got in Shanghai, so how much you needed to put in the museum from this education, how you could use it in Rwanda, and what other knowledge you needed to kind of get to the attitude or approach you now presented?
That's a really good question. Always makes me feel like I wasted my time. I don't always say that what I learned was not important to me when I go back to Rwanda, but I would say that a lot seemed odd, and that to me that's one of the failure of the current architecture education. The architecture time we have or we live in at the moment is disconnected from the real time we're living in, and is disconnected from the socio-economic political system times of each and every zones we work in. And the current architecture education does not prepare us for that, because Rwanda is it's a small country. It's called a country of 1,000 hills. There are hills everywhere. Finding a flat terrain is really difficult. I was learning in Shanghai. Every site I got when I was in studio was a flat site. And all the questions I would ask my professors in studio, they'll be like, in Chinese they use the word ibanda. Ibanda means like normally, this is how it's done, which means that means my country is an abnormality. So like if you go back and you're a young architect, you've never practiced before, you've never implemented a project, and the client comes and say, I want you to build me a house, and you have this slope, you'll be like, normally I don't build on this thing, naturally, right? So I think maybe that's a banal example. I should have given maybe a more sophisticated answer, but it shows you that we're not prepared. When we graduate from school, we're not prepared to tackle even much bigger challenges than just a simple site, because where we built there, like, again, socio-economic and political systems that are much more complicated and challenging that we have to navigate to do that. I was in Uganda yesterday, and people said statistics which were mind-blowing. Apparently, Uganda is a 35 million people country, and more than 60% of that population is below the age of 16 years old. That means the people who are actually going to be tackling Uganda's problems in terms of design and architecture in, let's say, 10 years from now, haven't even graduated from high school. And that's a big challenge on the continent. I mean, I speak a lot about Africa because it's the one that I've been able to go through and assess and speak to people. I'm sure Europe has its own problems, and the US has its own problems, Australia has its own problems. But to me, if the architecture education is still this I don't know how to call it, like this standardized monolithic thing that says, oh, this is theory, this is how you think about the process, this is how you do it, but ignores you to tell you like that's like knowledge that you're supposed to apply after you've learned so much about your context you lean on. It's this universal thing that can only work once you acknowledge the locality of where you need to apply it. That's the only difference. So that translation, I don't think it's correct at the moment. Now, there's also something that was said earlier, which resonated with me, is like, how much do we want that architecture education to respond to the current crisis we're in? Like, I'm presenting about the numbers in Africa, and I'm inclined to say I'm secured for a job for the rest of my life until I retire. But should we do that, or should we anticipate what's life going to be in 2050? Obviously, our lives are going to change, the lifestyle. I don't know what technology is going to exist there. Can we really craft a curriculum that prepares people for that and not just filling the gap what we have right now? Because I think that's what we should do, and not just say, how do we adapt the current situation so we can respond to this huge need we have? And by the time we finished crafting that, we were already in 2050. We were like, oh, we have new challenges. Now all this work is useless.
Thank you. I don't see any urgent questions anymore. We didn't talk about the role of digitalization. We didn't talk about mass customization. We didn't talk about the promise of all the parametricists like Sarah Ditt and Patrick Schumacher to be universal and specific at the same time without being regional. But I could imagine that this... but I could imagine that this could be one of the topics also for the next panel, which starts after the break at 6 o'clock. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.